There's probably a moment from your childhood that wasn't traumatic in any obvious way, that nobody else would even remember, and it still has a strange amount of power over you today. Maybe it's a specific tone of voice, a particular kind of silence at the dinner table, the exact way someone corrected you once or 100 times in a tone you can still hear perfectly even now. It wasn't abuse. It wasn't a single terrible event. And yet, decades later, something close to that exact feeling shows up in your adult relationships, and you don't fully understand why something so small still has that much weight. Here's what psychology actually explains about this. The moments that shape you most aren't always the loud, dramatic ones. Often, they're the small, repeated ones. And the reason they're so powerful has nothing to do with how serious they were, and everything to do with how often they happened. By the end of this video, you'll understand the specific mechanism behind this, why repetition matters more than intensity, and how to recognize when an adult reaction is actually an old, outdated response firing at the wrong target. Stay until the end, because the last part explains why the people closest to you are the ones most likely to accidentally trigger it. Let's start with a common misunderstanding about how emotional patterns actually form. Most people assume that lasting psychological impact requires a major event, something clearly traumatic, clearly identifiable, clearly big enough to count. But developmental psychology shows something different. The nervous system doesn't primarily encode impact based on severity. It encodes impact based on repetition and predictability. This is the foundation of what psychologists call an emotional schema, a kind of internal template built early in life that defines what to expect from close relationships, what certain feelings mean, and how safe or unsafe a particular kind of moment is likely to be. Schemas aren't built from single events in most cases. They're built from patterns, the same small experience, occurring repeatedly until your brain concludes it represents a reliable rule about how relationships work. Here's why that matters. A single dramatic event can actually be easier for the brain to process than a small thing that happens consistently. A single event gets stored as a distinct memory with a clear boundary. It happened, then it ended. A small repeated experience, on the other hand, doesn't get filed as a memory at all in the same way. It gets absorbed as an assumption about reality. Not "this happened to me once," but "this is simply how it is." This explains something many adults find confusing about themselves. They can point to no major trauma, no defining incident, and still react to certain situations with disproportionate intensity. The intensity isn't disproportionate to the actual memory, because there usually isn't one specific memory driving it. It's proportionate to how many times the pattern repeated, accumulated quietly over years, until it became the lens through which an entire category of experience gets interpreted. Let's make this concrete. Imagine a child who, growing up, regularly experienced a parent going quiet and distant after disagreements. Not yelling, not punishing, just a specific, recognizable withdrawal. No single instance of this would register as significant. But across hundreds of repetitions, the child's nervous system built a precise emotional schema. Disagreement leads to disconnection. Conflict means I become alone. That schema doesn't disappear simply because childhood ends. It becomes a kind of relational autopilot. As an adult, when a partner goes quiet during a disagreement, even briefly, even for completely unrelated reasons, the schema activates instantly. The adult doesn't consciously think, "This reminds me of my parent." They simply feel a wave of disproportionate panic, abandonment, or dread that seems to come from nowhere because the schema operates faster than conscious memory, triggered by a pattern match the rational mind never gets to evaluate first. This is the key mechanism behind why small things trigger adults in ways that seem to make no logical sense given the actual situation in front of them. The current moment isn't really what's being reacted to. The current moment is simply close enough, structurally, to the old repeated pattern that the schema fires automatically, treating decades-old data as if it were live information about the present. There's a second important detail. Emotional schemas are largely built from moments that seem too minor to matter at the time, which is precisely why they're so hard to identify later. Nobody sits down and consciously decides, this small recurring moment is shaping my entire relational template. It happens beneath conscious narrative, which means most adults have no clear memory to point to, only a strong, confusing reaction whose origin feels mysterious, even though the schema behind it was built through years of completely traceable, if unremarkable, repetition. So how do you actually identify and update a pattern you can't directly remember forming? First, pay attention to disproportion, not just discomfort. If a reaction feels significantly larger than the situation that triggered it, if a brief silence from a partner produces panic rather than mild concern, if a small correction at work produces shame rather than mild annoyance, that gap between stimulus and reaction is often the clearest evidence that an old schema, not the present moment, is doing most of the emotional work. Second, ask what the moment is structurally similar to, not what it literally is. Instead of asking, why does this small thing bother me so much? Ask, what does this small thing share, structurally, with something that used to happen repeatedly? Often the connection isn't about content, it's about pattern. A tone of voice, a particular kind of pause, a specific facial expression. The schema responds to structure, not topic. Third, deliberately collect counter-evidence in real time. Each time the schema activates and the predicted outcome doesn't actually occur, your partner's silence wasn't disconnection, the correction wasn't rejection, consciously register that mismatch instead of letting it pass unnoticed. Schemas update slowly through accumulated contrary evidence, not through a single insight. This step is slower than understanding the mechanism intellectually, but it's the actual process by which the template eventually shifts. Fourth, separate the size of the current moment from the size of your reaction to it. You don't need to make the reaction disappear. You need to recognize in the moment that you're responding partly to a pattern that's decades old, layered over a present situation that's actually much smaller than it feels. That recognition alone, without forcing the feeling away, often reduces its intensity simply by correctly identifying its real source. Here's what ties this together. The small, undramatic moments from your childhood were never too minor to matter. Repetition built power into them precisely because no single instance seemed significant enough to question. What feels today like an oversized reaction to something small is, in most cases, an old and once accurate emotional rule, built from real, repeated experience, simply firing in a context where it no longer applies. If this explained a reaction you've never fully understood, tell us in the comments about a small, ordinary moment from your childhood that still seems to carry more weight than it logically should. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden architecture behind your own emotional patterns, the next video is right there, waiting for you.